Marcella Vescari walked into that bridal suite like she owned every inch of it, because in her mind, she did. She didn't knock. She didn't smile. She simply pushed open the door, looked Nia Holloway up and down in that white dress, and said, with the kind of calm that is far more dangerous than screaming, "You can wear the ring. You can take the name. But you will never be one of us." If you have ever loved someone so much that their family's rejection felt like a physical wound, if you have ever stood in a room and been made to feel invisible by people who smiled at you in public, then you already know what Nia felt in that moment. And if you've ever had to choose between your dignity and the person you love most in this world, stay with me. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and what it truly means to belong. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. While you're at it, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning had started the way most important mornings do, not with drama, but with the quiet, almost unbearable weight of knowing that everything is about to change. Nia Holloway had been awake since 5. Not because of nerves exactly. She wasn't the kind of woman who unraveled easily. She'd spent 11 years teaching 3rd grade in one of the most underfunded school districts in Brooklyn, which meant she had long since learned how to hold herself together in rooms that didn't particularly want her to succeed. She knew how to breathe through difficulty. She knew how to smile at people who didn't smile back. She knew, better than most, that dignity was something you carried inside, yourself, not something other people granted you. But this morning was different. She sat at the vanity table in the bridal suite of the Whitmore Hotel, staring at her own reflection, and for a long moment she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Not because she looked bad. Her makeup artist had done extraordinary work. Her hair was swept up in a soft crown of natural curls pinned with tiny pearl clips that had belonged to her late grandmother. The dress simple, column-cut ivory silk, fit her the way dresses only fit you when someone has sewn it specifically to your body. She looked, by every external measure, exactly like a woman on the best day of her life. What she felt was something more complicated. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of something enormous, trying to decide if she was brave enough to jump. Adrian Vescari had proposed to her 14 months ago, in the kitchen of his penthouse apartment, wearing an old Columbia University sweatshirt and holding a spatula, because he'd been attempting badly to make her pancakes. He hadn't gotten down on one knee, which was very Adrian. He just turned from the stove, looked at her across the kitchen island with those dark, unreadable eyes of his, and said, "I want you to be my wife. Tell me yes before I burn these." She'd laughed so hard she'd cried. She'd said yes before the pancakes were ruined, though only barely. What came after that yes was where things got complicated. Nia had known, going in, that Adrian Vescari was not a simple man. You didn't date a man for 2 years without learning the essential truths about him. And the essential truth about Adrian was that he existed in a world that operated by rules most people didn't know existed. He ran legitimate real estate investments, a private security firm, and 3 hospitality businesses. He also was considerably less legitimate things that she had come to understand through pleading to silence and careful silence rather than explicit conversation. She wasn't naive. She was a woman who had chosen, with clear eyes, to love a man whose world was built in shadow. What she hadn't fully prepared herself for was his family. The Vescari family was old money layered over older secrets. They had roots in Sicily going back generations, a network of loyalties and obligations that functioned less like family bonds and more like a complex legal system, one that Marcella Vescari, Adrian's mother, had spent 40 years both enforcing and embodying. Marcella was 71 years old, elegantly dressed at all times, and possessed of the specific terrifying quality that some women develop when they have spent decades being the most powerful person in every room they enter. She was not loud. She was not cruel in obvious ways. She was the kind of woman who could destroy your sense of self with a single raised eyebrow, and she did it with such practiced grace that you sometimes didn't realize what had happened until you were already alone in your car, crying, and trying to figure out exactly which sentence had done it. Nia had met Marcella 11 times over the course of their relationship. 11 times, Marcella had been perfectly polite. 11 times, Nia had left feeling like she'd failed an exam she hadn't been given the questions to. Adrian had noticed. He always noticed things. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner at the Vescari family estate in Westchester, he'd reached across the car console and taken her hand without saying anything. They'd driven in silence for several miles before he finally spoke. "She'll come around," he'd said. Nia had looked out the window at the highway lights, blurring past. What if she doesn't? He'd squeezed her hand. Then she doesn't. "You're still mine." She'd wanted to believe that was enough. Standing at the vanity now, she turned her grandmother's ring. Over on her right hand, she'd moved it there this morning to make room for the wedding band that would replace the engagement ring on her left. And she thought about the word mine, the way Adrian said it, like it was a fortress rather than a possession, like it was the most protected thing in the world. A knock at the suite door pulled her out of her thoughts. She assumed it was her maid of honor, Keisha, coming back with the champagne she'd gone to retrieve 20 minutes ago. Or maybe the wedding coordinator, nervous about timing. The ceremony was set for 2 o'clock. It was just past 10. "Come in," she called. The door opened. It was not Keisha. Marcella Vescari entered first, wearing a deep burgundy dress that probably cost more than Nia's monthly rent had been before she met Adrian. Behind her came Lucia Belandi, Marcella's older sister, 76 years old, small and bird-boned in a way that somehow made her seem sharper rather than frail. They moved together with the coordinated ease of women who had spent decades operating as a unit, and the suite door clicked shut behind them with a sound that, in retrospect, Nia would remember as the sound of a trap closing. "Nia." Marcella's voice was warm. Her eyes were not. "Marcella." Nia rose from the vanity stool. She was careful to keep her voice steady. "I wasn't expecting you. We thought we'd come early." Lucia smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had never in her life needed to make anyone feel comfortable. Before the chaos begins, there was a brief, weighted silence. Then Marcella sat down uninvited on the small sofa near the window, crossed her ankles precisely, and looked at Nia with an expression that was almost kind. "Almost. You look beautiful," she said. And then, without pausing, without changing her tone at all, "Adrian has always had an eye for beautiful things." Nia heard the distinction immediately. Things. Not women. Not people. Things. She filed it away and kept her face neutral. "Thank you. We wanted to speak with you privately," Marcella continued, "before today becomes official." She gestured at the dress. The suite, the general splendor of the occasion, as though it were a prop rather than a celebration. "There are things that should be said clearly between women, so that there are no misunderstandings later." Nia sat back down on the vanity stool. She wasn't going to stand there, looking like she was waiting to be dismissed, and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm listening." What came next was delivered in the same even, composed tone Marcella used for everything. There was no screaming, no vulgarity, just words, chosen carefully and placed precisely, the way you place knives. She told Nia that the marriage could proceed. She acknowledged that Adrian had made his choice, and that the Vescari family respected his autonomy in this matter. She said these things graciously, like she was granting a pardon, and then she explained the terms. Nia could wear the ring. She could take the name. She could attend family events and sit at family tables and be introduced as Adrian's wife. But she would remain, in the truest sense, an outsider to the Vescari bloodline. This was not about her character, Marcella said. Not about her profession or her background. It was simply about lineage, about what the Vescari name meant and had always meant. Lucia nodded along slowly, like a woman hearing scripture she had memorized years ago. And then Marcella said the thing that cracked something open inside Nia's chest. "If you have children with my son," she said, "I will not recognize them as Vescari heirs. Not in the family trust, not in the succession, not at the table." She paused. "I want you to understand that clearly before you make vows you cannot unmake." The room was very quiet. Nia looked at Marcella's face and understood with absolute clarity that this woman had said this before. Not to Nia specifically, but she had rehearsed this. She had sat somewhere, maybe in the same house where Adrian grew up, and she had worked out exactly how to say this in a way that sounded almost reasonable, almost like concern, almost like honesty. It was none of those things. It was a warning. It was a boundary drawn in a place where Nia had never invited anyone to draw one. It was a woman telling her, on her wedding morning, that the children she had not yet had would enter the world already insufficient. Nia thought about those children. She had spent 14 months trying not to think about them too specifically, because specificity made things hurt more. But now, in this moment, they became suddenly, terribly real to her. A little girl with Adrian's jaw and her own eyes. A boy who laughed too loud, the way Nia's father had laughed. Children who would grow up knowing exactly who they were, because Nia would make certain of it, and who would also grow up sitting at a dinner table where their grandmother looked through them like they were furniture. She felt the grief of it before she even had them. She felt it the way you feel the cold before the storm actually arrives. And then, because she was Nia Holloway, and not someone who performed for audiences she didn't respect, she took a slow breath and she answered. Her voice was quiet. It was not shaking. "My children," she said, "will never beg anyone for permission to belong." Marcella blinked. Just once. "Not your approval," Nia continued. "Not this family's approval. Not any table's approval." She looked at Marcella directly and didn't look away. "They will know who they are. They will know where they come from. And they will never not once be made feel that someone else's cruelty has anything to do with their worth." Lucia made a small sound. Not quite a scoff. Something more restrained. Marcella's expression didn't change. But something shifted behind her eyes. Some things that might have been surprise, quickly covered. "That's a lovely sentiment," Marcella said finally. Her tone had gone careful in a new way. "But sentiment doesn't change bloodline." "No," Nia agreed. "It doesn't." She stood up, then not dramatically, not with any performance of confidence, just stood, because sitting felt wrong in that moment, felt like accepting a position she hadn't agreed to. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands and looked at these two women, these elegant, formidable, deeply frightened women, and she said the only other thing she had to say. "I'm going to marry your son today. I'm going to love him the way he deserves to be loved. And I'm going to build a family that reflects every value he and I share together." She paused. "I hope you'll both be part of that, genuinely. But I also need you to understand that my children's place in this world is not contingent on your acceptance of it." Neither woman spoke. Nia turned back to the mirror. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. It took Marcella and Lucia another 3 or 4 minutes to leave. There was some additional maneuvering references to Adrian's previous relationships, to the weight of the Vescari name in New York society, to the women who might have been better suited. None of this said with overt cruelty, but all of it aimed with precision, and Nia absorbed it the way she'd learned to absorb hard things. Not by going numb, by going still. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, she sat alone in the suite for exactly 60 seconds. Then she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and let herself feel it, all of it, the hurt and the fury and the complicated grief of loving someone whose family had decided, before they knew her, that she was not enough. She let herself feel the full weight of what Marcella had said about her unborn children, and she let herself feel the fear underneath it. The fear that the woman might be right, not about lineage or bloodlines, but about the reality that Nia might be walking into a life where her children would have to fight for their right to simply exist in peace. She thought, for the first time seriously, about not walking down that aisle. Not because she didn't love Adrian. She loved him with the specific, difficult, clear-eyed love of a woman who has chosen someone knowing exactly what the cost might be. She loved him in the way that survives inconvenience and conflict, and the specific intimacy of watching someone navigate their own failures. She loved him completely. But love, she had long since learned, was not sufficient protection against everything. And she could not bring children into a family that had already decided to reject them. She would not let the first lesson her children learned about themselves be that their grandmother had weighed them and found them wanting. She sat with that thought, the thought of leaving, of calling Keisha and saying quietly, "I can't do it. Get me out of here." And she let it be a real option. She didn't dismiss it. She turned it over. And then she heard, through the partially open window, a sound she wasn't expecting. It was so soft she almost missed it. It was the sound of a footstep in the corridor outside, and then a long, complete silence where a sound should have been, the sound of someone walking away, but staying. She didn't know then what it meant. She would understand it later. She would understand, much later, that while she had been sitting in that suite, making the hardest decision of her life, the man she loved had been standing 10 feet away in the corridor, his back against the wall, his hand pressed flat against the wallpaper, listening to everything his mother had said to the woman he had chosen, and listening to the way Nia had answered her. But Nia didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that she had a decision to make, and she had less than 4 hours to make it. She looked at herself in the mirror one more time, at the dress that fit like it had been made for her, because it had been, at the pearl clips that had belonged to the grandmother who had raised her and taught her the first and most important thing she'd ever learned about dignity, that it wasn't something you earned from other people's good opinions. It was something you kept, no matter what. She reached up and straightened one of the clips. Then she went to find Keisha. She didn't tell Keisha what had happened. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That was the thing about carrying something like this. You had to decide, first, whether it was a burden to share or a weight you needed to hold alone long enough to understand its shape. What she did tell Keisha was that she needed 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes alone. Keisha, who had known Nia for 22 years and could read her silences the way most people read words, handed her the champagne glass without a word and stepped outside. Nia sat by the window. She held the glass. She didn't drink from it. She thought about Adrian's hands, the way he held her face when he kissed her, the way he listened, really listened, which was something she hadn't expected from him when they first met, because he was the kind of man that rooms rearranged themselves around, and men like that sometimes forgot how to actually hear what was being said to them. But Adrian listened like listening was the thing he was best at. Like her voice was information he was collecting and keeping somewhere important. She thought about the night 8 months into their relationship when she'd told him about her father's death. She'd kept it controlled, the way she kept most things, but somewhere in the middle of the story she'd lost control of it. And she'd cried in a way she hadn't cried in front of anyone in years. Adrian had not said anything reassuring. He had not offered platitudes. He had just put his arms around her and stayed there, completely present, until she was done. She had trusted him with that. She still trusted him. Question was whether trust was enough to build a family on, when the walls of that family had already been reinforced against you. She stared out the window at the city, moving below her cabs and pedestrians, and the ordinary relentless motion of New York, which cared nothing about weddings or mafia bosses, or the quiet devastation of a woman in a silk dress, trying to decide whether love was worth the price being asked of her. She finished the champagne in one slow sip, and she made her decision. She wasn't leaving, not because she was giving up on her children's dignity, not because she'd decided Marcella's cruelty didn't matter. She was staying because running would mean letting Marcella's words have the last word. And Nia Holloway had never in her life let someone else's cruelty write the ending of her story. She was going to walk down that aisle, and after that, after she stood in front of every person in that room and said her vows, with her whole chest, she would figure out what came next. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and went to tell Keisha she was ready. She did not know, walking toward that elevator, that Adrian Vescari had already made his own decision. She did not know that the man she trusted had heard every word, had stood in the corridor, with his jaw locked and his hands still, had listened to his mother try to diminish the woman he loved, and listened to. That woman refused to be diminished and had walked away from that door, carrying something that felt in his chest, like the specific kind of fury that doesn't burn hot. It burns quiet. It burns for a long time. And it doesn't stop until something changes permanently. Adrian Vescari had a rule about emotion. He'd learned it from his father, not through any deliberate lesson, but through years of watching the man operate in rooms where the wrong feeling at the wrong moment could cost you everything. The rule was simple. Whatever you felt it later. You filed it away somewhere behind your eyes, behind your jaw, behind the particular stillness that powerful men learned to wear like a second skin, and you dealt with the situation in front of you first. You felt things later, alone, when the door was closed and no one was watching, and the feeling couldn't be used against you. Adrian had been running on that rule for 34 years. He was running on it now. He stood in the corridor outside the bridal suite with his back pressed flat against the wall, and his dress shirt half-buttoned, and his hands. His hands that people in 3A boroughs were genuinely afraid of pressed palm down against the wallpaper like he needed something solid to hold on to. He could hear his own breathing. That was unusual. Adrian Vescari was not, as a rule, aware of his own breathing. He controlled rooms without trying. He had sat across from men who wanted him dead and felt nothing but a cold, operational calm. But he had just listened to his mother tell the woman he loved that their unborn children that didn't exist yet, children that were nothing more than a future he'd been quietly building toward, would not be recognized, would not be accepted, would not belong. And then he had listened to Nia answer her. He hadn't moved during any of it. He'd come down this hallway to leave her a note, something small and private, not the kind of thing he'd say in front of people, and he'd heard his mother's voice through the door before he'd raised his hand to knock. He'd recognized the particular tone immediately. He'd heard it before, aimed at other people, but never at someone he loved. He'd stopped. He'd listened. He'd stayed still through the whole of it, every word landing somewhere in his chest that he was going to have to deal with later, much later, when he had the time and privacy to fall apart appropriately. He waited until he heard the low movement inside. That meant Marcella and Lucia were getting up to leave. Then he straightened up from the wall, turned, and walked back down the corridor the way he'd come. Not fast, not slow. The walk of a man who is deciding something permanent and taking his time about it. He did not go back to the groom's suite. He went to find Marco. Marco Vitale had worked for Adrian for 9 years. He was 38, compact, and had the specific quality of absolute discretion that made him more valuable than any amount of physical capability. He could be in a room and not register. He remembered everything. He executed without editorializing. He was in the hierarchy of people Adrian trusted, near the top of a very short list. Adrian found him outside the venue's service entrance, where he'd been stationed since 7 that morning, managing the quiet logistics that surrounded an event like this, the ones that had nothing to do with flowers or catering. "I need you to do something," Adrian said. Marco looked at him. Just looked. He had learned over 9 years that the way Adrian Vescari's jaw sat when he was making a decision versus the way it sat when he was simply giving an instruction were two different things. Right now the jaw was doing the decision thing. "What do you need?" Marco said. "My mother's house accounts, the Westchester Property Management, the 2 investment funds she sits on as a named beneficiary of my grandfather's trust." Adrian said this the way you'd read a grocery list. "I want everything transferred and locked before the end of this day. All of it moved to the main holding entity under my sole signature. I want her access codes flagged for review. I want Lucia's name removed from the donor list for the foundation gala in October." Marco didn't blink today, before 2 o'clock if possible. Marco was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He was not questioning the order. He was calculating logistics. The trust transfer is going to require Aldo's signature. Aldo will sign. Adrian's voice was flat. "Call him. Tell him it's necessary. And if he asks why, tell him I said it's necessary." He paused. "He won't ask twice." Marco nodded once. His hand was already moving toward the phone in his jacket pocket. Adrian turned to go. "Adrian." Marco's voice stopped him. Not the way most people stopped him carefully, apologetically, but with the directness that Adrian had specifically cultivated in the people he trusted. Marco only used his first name when he thought something needed to be said. "Your mother is going to know this happened before the ceremony is over." "Yes," Adrian said. "She is. She's going to make a scene. She's going to try." He turned back just far enough to look at Marco over his shoulder. "Make sure the transfers are timestamped before 1:30. Whatever happens at 2 o'clock, I want it already done." He left Marco standing at the service entrance and went back inside the hotel. He took the elevator to the 4th floor. Not the floor the bridal suite was on, not the floor the groom's suite was on, but the floor where the hotel had a small business center that was mostly empty on a Saturday morning. He sat down at a table by the window with a glass of water he didn't drink and spent 22 minutes being very still. He thought about Nia's voice. He had heard her afraid before. Not often she was not a woman who let fear surface easily, but he'd learned to recognize it in the texture of her sentences, the way certain words got slightly smaller than they should. He had not heard that in the suite. What he'd heard was something else entirely. Something that, if he was being honest with himself, he had not been entirely certain she possessed in that specific quantity. Not because he doubted her. He had never doubted her. But there was a difference between knowing someone was strong and watching them hold still while someone tries to dismantle them. She had held very still. And then she had said, with a quiet that was somehow louder than anything Marcella had managed, "My children will never beg anyone for permission to belong." He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth and stared out the window at nothing. He had not told Nia everything about his family. Not because he wanted to deceive her, he was, within the particular moral framework of his world, a man who valued honesty with the people who mattered to him, but because some things about the Vescari family were not his to disclose, and some things were simply too ugly to hand to someone you loved before. They'd decided whether the life was worth choosing. He had told himself it was protection. He understood now that it had also been a cowardice of a specific and quiet kind. Cowardice of hoping things would smooth themselves out, of believing that Marcella would eventually relent. She had not relented. She had waited until the morning of his wedding and gone to the bridal suite and told his future wife that their future children were not legitimate. He picked up his glass of water and set it back down, without drinking. He thought about what kind of man he was going to be today. Not later. Not in 6 months, when the dust had settled and the family had rearranged itself around whatever he decided. Today. In the next 3 hours. What kind of man was going to walk down to that altar? He already knew the answer. He'd known it standing in the corridor. He was going to be the man Nia had agreed to marry, the one she had looked at across a kitchen counter covered in pancake batter and decided was worth saying yes to. He was going to be that man, publicly, loudly, and in front of every person his family had ever cared about impressing. And he was going to be something else, too. He was going to be clear. He got up from the table, straightened his shirt, and went back to get ready. The groom's suite was on the 6th floor, and when Adrian walked in, he found his younger brother Dante sitting on the arm of the sofa eating a bread roll from the reception menu and scrolling his phone with the particular disengaged energy of a 28-year-old who found formal occasions tedious. Dante looked up when he came in. Something in Adrian's face made Dante put the bread roll down. "What happened?" Dante said. "Nothing." Adrian went to the mirror and started buttoning his shirt properly. "Adrian, I said nothing happened, Dante." Dante was quiet for a moment. "Then I saw Mama and Zia Lucia going up to the bridal floor about an hour ago." He kept his voice casual, but his eyes were doing the opposite of casual. "I thought that was weird." Adrian said nothing. "Did they go see Nia?" "Yes." And Adrian turned from the mirror and looked at his brother directly. Dante was not like him. Dante was warmer, more easily read, less suited to the particular coldness that their world sometimes required. Dante had their father's laugh and their mother's stubbornness, and the specific recklessness of someone who had grown up protected by an older brother, who made sure nothing truly bad ever reached him. He was also, underneath all of that, a decent man. One of the few people Adrian trusted without calculation. "Mama told Nia that our children won't be recognized as Vescari heirs," Adrian said. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when someone tries to find a response and can't locate one. Dante opened his mouth, closed it. "She said that. This morning. In the bridal suite, on your..." Dante stopped. "Started again. On the morning of your wedding." "Yes." Dante stood up from the sofa arm. He was not a tall man, but he had a way of occupying space when he was angry that made him seem larger than he was. His face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in the last 10 seconds, and had landed on something that looked like the specific fury of a younger sibling who has just realized the thing he always vaguely feared about his mother is actually real. He shook his head. "Adrian, that's not okay." "No," Adrian agreed. "It isn't. What are you going to do?" Adrian picked up his jacket from the chair. "Get married." "I mean about Mama?" "I know what you meant." He slid the jacket on and checked his cuffs. "She'll understand what's happening when it happens. I'm not going to discuss it with her beforehand." Dante stared at him. "She's going to lose her mind, probably. In front of everyone. That will be her choice." He turned back to the mirror and adjusted his tie. "I'm not responsible for how she receives consequences." Another silence. Dante said quietly, "Is Nia okay?" Adrian looked at his own reflection for a moment. She's better than okay, he said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, not pride exactly. Something with more weight than pride. Something that sounded like a man who has just understood, fully and finally, exactly what he has in the woman waiting 4 floors below him. She's going to be fine. Dante nodded slowly. Then he picked his bread roll back up, looked at it, and set it back down. I'm not hungry anymore. Don't let Mama see that you know something, Adrian said. How am I supposed to, Dante? His voice was not unkind. Just act normal. Eat your bread. Tell her she looks beautiful when she comes in. You've been doing it your whole life. Dante looked at him for a long moment. That's a depressing thing to say. Yes, Adrian said. It is. He left the suite and went to make 2 more phone calls before noon. Downstairs, in a different world entirely, Nia was sitting in the bridal suite with Keisha, who had come back with the champagne and a second glass she'd poured for herself, and they were doing what they had done together since they were 19 years old, in the same college dormitory, which was sitting in the same room and saying nothing, because sometimes nothing was the only language that worked. Keisha had looked at Nia when she came back in, and she had seen something on Nia's face that she recognized. Not tears. Nia rarely cried in front of people. That was not how she was built, but the specific compression around her eyes and the quality of stillness in her jaw that meant something had happened that Nia was actively processing. Keisha had learned, over 22 years, that you didn't push when Nia went still like that. You stayed in the room. You handed her champagne. You waited. She waited. It was almost 11 before Nia spoke. Can I ask you something? Always, Keisha said. Nia looked down at the champagne glass. If someone you loved, someone you genuinely loved, not just were attached to, but actually loved, if they came from a family that had already decided your kids weren't going to be good enough for them, would you still? She stopped, reorganized. Would you still have the kids? Keisha was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was making sure she gave the right one. Is this theoretical? She said. Nia didn't answer that. Keisha set her glass down. Nia, what happened? Nothing I can't handle. That's not what I asked. The 2 women looked at each other. 22 years of friendship in that look. 22 years of knowing exactly when the other one was carrying something too heavy to hold alone. Nia took a breath. Marcella came up here this morning. Keisha's face went very still in a different way. What did she say? Nia told her. Not all of it, she edited as she spoke, keeping the most brutal parts compressed into smaller shapes, but enough. Enough that Keisha's expression moved through shock and landed somewhere in a cold, quiet fury that was recognizable to anyone who had known her. Keisha was not a woman who performed emotion. When she felt something, it went into her eyes first, and right now her eyes looked like the kind of weather that preceded serious damage. She said that, Keisha said. About your kids. On your wedding morning. Yes. And she came here specifically, yes, to your suite, to say that. Keisha, I'm clarifying. Keisha picked her champagne glass back up, looked at it, and put it back down. I need to go down there, and you're not going anywhere. Nia, Keisha. Nia's voice was soft, but it was also a door closing. I need you to stay here and help me get ready. That's what I need from you right now. Keisha breathed out slowly through her nose. It was the breath of a woman exercising restraint that cost her something real. Okay, she said finally. Okay. A pause. You're still going through with it. It wasn't a question. She could read Nia well enough to know the answer already. Yes, Nia said. Because you love him. Because I love him. And because I'm not letting that woman write the ending of my wedding day. Nia's voice was even. Completely even. She already tried to write it. She failed. I'm not giving her a second draft. Keisha looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the particular economy of movement that characterized women who had earned their own kind of toughness, she picked up her champagne glass and held it out. Okay then, she said. Nia touched her glass to Keisha's. They didn't say anything else about it. Keisha spent the next hour helping Nia with the final adjustments, the bustle on the back of the dress that kept sitting slightly wrong. The lipstick that needed 3 attempts before the color looked the way Nia wanted it to. The pearl clips that had to be reset twice because the hotel's humidity was doing something unpleasant to the updo. They talked about other things. Small things. Keisha's son's soccer game from the previous weekend. A movie they'd both been meaning to watch. The slightly alarming quantity of shrimp they'd spotted on the appetizer table earlier. Normal things, ordinary things. The kind of conversation that serves as scaffolding when the structure underneath is under stress. At 12:40, there was another knock at the door. Nia's body went tight before she'd consciously registered it. Just for a second. Then the door opened, and it was the wedding coordinator, a brisk, efficient woman named Susan, who wore a headset and carried a clipboard-like weapon, and the world resumed its normal shape. "We're about 40 minutes out from the processional," Susan said, scanning Nia with professional assessment. "You look wonderful. I need to steal your maid of honor for about 10 minutes to confirm the timing with the musicians." Keisha gave Nia a look. "Go," Nia said. "I'm fine." When the door closed behind them, Nia stood alone in the suite for the second time that morning. She walked to the window and looked out at the same city she'd been looking at 2 hours ago. The same cabs, the same pedestrians, the same ordinary, relentless motion of a place that would be completely unchanged by whatever happened today. She thought about her mother, who had died when Nia was 12. She thought about her father, who had raised her alone and done it imperfectly and beautifully, who had told her when she was 16 that the most important thing anyone could know about themselves was that their worth was not a negotiation. She thought about her grandmother, whose ring she was wearing on her right hand, who had lived through the particular kind of systematic rejection that made Marcella Vescari's cruelty look like amateur work, and who had never once allowed herself to be defined by what other people refused to see in her. She came from those women. She came from the specific toughness of people who had been told, in every possible way, that they were not enough, and who had responded by building their own tables and seating whoever they loved. She straightened her spine. She looked at herself in the mirror one final time. And then the knock that came at the door was not Susan. It was Marcella. She was alone this time. Lucia was not with her. She stood in the doorway, with her hands folded in front of her, and her face arranged in an expression that was not quite an apology, but was something in that direction, the expression of a woman who has been told something she didn't want to hear, and is still in the process of deciding whether to believe it. Nia stood very still. "I'm not here to continue our earlier conversation," Marcella said. "Good," Nia said. A short, tight silence. "I want you to understand," Marcella began. "I understand everything you intended me to understand," Nia said. Clearly, her voice had the quality of a locked room. "I don't think there's anything you need to add." Marcella looked at her for a long moment. Something was working behind her eyes' calculation, or something like regret, or the specific discomfort of a woman who has wielded power her whole life and has just encountered a wall it didn't penetrate. "You're different than I expected," Marcella said finally. "Yes," Nia said. "I imagine I am." Another silence. "Adrian chose well," Marcella said. "He came out strange, not gracious exactly, but effortful. Like a word in a language she didn't speak comfortably." Nia didn't answer. Marcella nodded once to herself, it seemed, more than to Nia, and then she left. The door closed. Nia stood in the quiet of the suite and pressed one hand flat against her sternum, where something was happening that was not quite fear and not quite relief, but somewhere between them, the feeling of a woman who has been in the ring for several rounds and is still standing and is not entirely sure what that means yet. She didn't have long to sit with it, because 30 seconds after Marcella's footsteps faded down the corridor, she heard something else. A different set of footsteps. Purposeful. Familiar in a way that made her breath catch. And then a voice outside the door that she recognized and had not expected. Nia. Adrian's voice. Low. Not knocking, not calling through the door, just saying her name as if it was enough, as if the name itself was the knock. "I need 2 minutes." She crossed the room and opened the door. He was standing in the corridor in his full wedding attire, dark suit, white shirt, tie not quite straight, which she immediately clocked as intentional, because Adrian's tie was never accidentally crooked. He'd done that deliberately. And his face, she looked at his face and found something in it that she had only seen a handful of times in 3 years. Not distress, exactly, not guilt. Something more specific. The face of a man who is standing on the other side of a decision that cannot be undone, and is making sure, one final time, that it's the right one. "Adrian I was in the corridor," he said, earlier. "When they were here, she went completely still. I heard it. His voice was quiet. Not soft quiet, there was a difference. All of it. The world seemed to rearrange itself very slightly around her. You heard everything. His jaw moved. What she said about our children. A pause that carried significant weight. What you said back to her. Nia couldn't speak for a moment. She was recalibrating, going back through the morning, through every word she'd said, understanding that he'd been 10 feet away, and she hadn't known, and feeling, underneath the shock of that, something that might have been relief, or might have been something far more complicated. "Why didn't you come in?" she said. His eyes didn't move from her face. "Because I needed to hear how you handled it." She stared at him. "I know that sounds," he stopped. Searched for something. "I needed to know what you did when I wasn't in the room, Nia. I needed to know what you would fight for when there was no audience." His voice was careful but not calculated. It had the texture of something he'd been working toward for a while. "And I needed you to fight that battle yourself. Because you needed to win it yourself." She breathed. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She nodded. "What happened this morning is not going to happen again. Not to you. Not to our children. Not ever." He said this with the specific flat certainty that she associated with the part of him that his business associates feared. Not a promise, a statement of fact about the future. "I've already taken care of some of it. The rest happens today." He paused. In public. She felt something shift in her chest. "What does that mean?" she said. "Adrian, what are you planning?" He looked at her for a moment, that way. He looked at her like she was information he was gathering and filing somewhere important. And then he said, "It means that everyone who watched my mother build her empire on this family's names is going to watch me define what this family actually is." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below them, in the venue, the string quartet was doing a sound check. She could hear it, faintly something classical, something that floated up through 3 floors of hotel infrastructure, like it, belonged to a different world. "Are you sure?" she said. "Yes. There's no taking it back." "I know." His eyes were steady. "Are you still walking down that aisle?" She looked at him. At the tie he'd deliberately left slightly crooked. At the face of the man who had learned her voice the way cartographers learn coastlines carefully, specifically, with an understanding that the shape of it mattered. "Yes," she said. Something in his jaw released by a fraction. "Then go finish getting ready," he said. "I'll see you down there." He turned to go. "Adrian." Her voice stopped him. He looked back. "Whatever you're planning," she said, "I need you to know that I didn't ask for it. I'm not asking you to fight this battle for me." "I know you're not," he said. "This isn't for you." He paused. "It's for the table you're going to sit at for the rest of your life. And for the kids who are going to sit at it with you." His eyes held hers for one more second. "Nobody gets to decide who belongs at my table except me." He left. She stood in the doorway watching the corridor after he'd gone, and she understood fully, finally, in the way that you understand things that change the shape of everything after that. The ceremony that was about to happen was not the event she had been preparing for. It was something else entirely. She went back inside. She closed the door. She looked at herself in the mirror with completely different eyes than she'd had an hour ago, not more confident, not less afraid, but cleaner somehow. Clearer, like something that had been smeared across her morning had been wiped away, and she could finally see what was actually there. Picked up her bouquet from the table. Downstairs. At that precise moment, Marco Vitale was sending the confirmation message that meant the transfers were complete, time-stamped at 1:17 in the afternoon, 43 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin. And as Marcella Vescari, sitting in the front row of the venue in her burgundy dress, was about to feel the very first tremor of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She didn't know what it was yet. She would recognize it in approximately 45 minutes. It was the specific, unmistakable feeling of the ground beginning to move beneath a throne that was supposed to be permanent. The string quartet stopped mid-phrase. Not a natural pause. Not a breath between movements. A stop the kind that happens when someone in the room does something that makes the musicians lose their place without realizing they've lost it. The kind of stop that takes a second for everyone to notice, and then, once they notice, becomes the only thing in the room. It was 1:47 in the afternoon. The ceremony had been scheduled for 2 o'clock. Adrian had stopped it 13 minutes early. He had walked to the center of the altar space, not behind the officiant's podium, not to the side, but to the exact center. the place where both he and Nia were supposed to stand together. And he had turned to face the assembled guests with an expression that the people who knew him well would later describe in separate conversations, using almost identical words, like a door being closed from the inside. 312 people were seated in that room. Family, business associates, politicians who owed favors, old friends and older enemies, and the specific category of person who attends a Vescari event because not attending a Vescari event carries its own kind of message. They were dressed in the particular splendor of people who understand that occasions like this are also performances. And they had been watching the processional, with the politely calibrated attention of an audience that knows how to observe without appearing to. And then Adrian had stopped it. Nia was standing at the back of the room. She had just appeared at the end of the aisle, Keisha, beside her, the string quartet mid-phrase, and she had taken exactly 3 steps when Adrian moved to the center, and the music stopped, and 312 people turned, in the particular unified motion of a crowd catching the same scent of something wrong, and looked at him. Nia stopped walking. She stood at the back of the room with her bouquet held in both hands, and her heart doing something she couldn't name, and she looked at the man at the altar who had, in their corridor conversation 40 minutes ago, told her he was going to do something today that couldn't be taken back. She had thought she was prepared for it. She was not prepared for it. Adrian did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The room had its own acoustics, and a man who had spent 20 years making rooms go quiet when he entered them had a particular understanding of how to fill a space with sound without ever seeming to try. Before we begin, he said there are some things that need to be said. Somewhere near the front, on the left side, the Vescari family side, a woman shifted in her seat. Marcella. Nia could see her from the back of the room, the burgundy of her dress unmistakable, the particular quality of her stillness changing in a way that looked, even from 60 feet away, like a woman whose body has just received information it doesn't yet know how to process. This family, Adrian said, has a name that carries weight. I know that. I was born into that weight. I've carried it my whole life, and I'll carry it until I'm done. He paused. Not for effect. He wasn't a man who paused for effect. He paused because the next sentence required precision. But weight can be used to build things, or it can be used to crush them. And this morning, it was used to try to crush something I won't allow to be crushed. The room was the specific silence of 300 people holding their breath at the same time. Marcella's back was very straight. My mother came to my wife's bridal suite this morning, Adrian said, and there it was. The sentence that changed the air in the room. Nia felt it from 60 feet away, felt the shift, the collective intake, the way 300 people recalibrated simultaneously. Beside her, Keisha made a sound that was barely a sound, just a small exhale, like someone absorbing a physical impact. She told Nia that any children we have together would not be recognized as Vescari heirs. His voice was still even, still controlled, but something in the imness itself had a quality that was almost more frightening than anger, would have been the quality of a man who has felt everything he needs to feel about this, and is now simply reporting facts. She said this on the morning of our wedding, in the bridal suite, without my knowledge and without my consent. Lucia Belandi, 3 seats from Marcella, turned to look at her sister. Marcella did not turn back. I want everyone in this room to understand something clearly, Adrian said. Nia Holloway is not a woman who married into this family. She is a woman who chose to join her life to mine, knowing exactly what that life looked like. And she made that choice, with more clear eyes and more dignity than most of the people in this room have shown her. He let that land. She is my equal. In this house, in this family, in every room she ever enters that carries my name. He paused one more time. And our children, whenever they come, will be recognized as my heirs. Unquestioned, uncontested, by everyone at this table or by no one. Turned then. He turned and looked directly at Marcella. 300 people turned with him, because that was the nature of a room, that someone controlled it, moved when he moved, oriented when he oriented. Marcella was suddenly visibly the subject of 300 sets of eyes, and the woman who had spent 40 years being the most powerful presence in every room she entered was experiencing, for what appeared to be the first time, the specific sensation of being displayed rather than watching. Her face did not crumble. Nia would give her that. Whatever Marcella Vescari was, she was not a woman who crumbled in public. Her jaw stayed level, her shoulders stayed back. But her hands, folded in her lap with the composed elegance of a woman who controlled everything. Her hands tightened against each other in a way that Nia could see, even from the back of the room, even through 60 feet of expensive air, and held breath and the residual ghost of string quartet music. I love my mother, Adrian said, still looking at her. I have loved her my whole life. I will love her until I'm done. That does not change today. A beat. What changes today is what she is permitted to do with that love. He looked away from Marcella. He looked at Nia, and the room, all 312 people of it, looked at Nia too. She stood at the back of the aisle in the ivory silk dress, with her grandmother's pearl clips and her bouquet held in hands that were steadier than she felt, and she looked at the man at the altar who had just done, in public and without flinching, something that she had not asked him to do and had not expected anyone to do for her. And she felt something move through her chest that was too large and too complicated to name. In the moment, something that she would spend the next several months slowly identifying and would eventually recognize as the specific feeling of being seen, not performed for, not accommodated, not tolerated, but actually completely seen by someone who had the power to choose otherwise and chose not to. She started walking. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. She walked the way she'd been walking her whole life, like the ground under her feet belonged to her, and the string quartet, responding to some signal she didn't see, began again somewhere behind the silence, and the room exhaled, and Keisha, who had been standing beside Nia, with her bouquet gripped white-knuckled, and her eyes bright with the particular emotion of someone trying very hard not to cry at someone else's wedding, before the ceremony had technically started, made another small sound that this time sounded like relief. Nias reached the altar. Adrian took her hand. His grip was firm and warm and slightly tighter than it needed to be, which told her everything she needed to know about what that speech had cost him, about the difference between the controlled delivery and the actual interior state of the man who had delivered it. She squeezed back. The officiant, a composed older man, who had clearly decided, with admirable professional flexibility, that he was simply going to proceed as though everything was entirely normal, cleared his throat gently, and opened his book. But here is what Nia did not know. Here is what none of them knew, not Nia, not Keisha, not Dante sitting pale-faced in the second row, not Marco standing at the back with his phone in his jacket pocket and his eyes tracking the room with the professional vigilance of a man whose job was to notice things. What none of them knew was that there was a fourth person who had been in the corridor that morning. Not during the confrontation between Marcella and Nia that had been private, just the two women in the door and Adrian on the other side of it. But afterward, in the 40 minutes between Adrian leaving the corridor and Adrian arriving at the groom's suite, there had been someone else in that hallway. Someone who had seen Adrian walk away from the bridal suite door. Someone who had watched his face as he turned, and who had read, in the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his stillness, exactly what was coming. That person was Dominic Ferrante. Dominic was 63 years old, silver-haired, and held the title of the family's legal counsel, a role he had occupied for 22 years and which, in the Vescari structure, meant something considerably more than the word legal implied. He was the man who moved money. He was the man who made problems disappear on paper. He was the man who had, for 2 decades, existed at the precise intersection of what the Vescari family was and what it appeared to be, managing the gap between those two things with extraordinary skill and extraordinary loyalty. His loyalty, however, was not to Adrian. It had never been to Adrian. It was to Marcella. This was a fact that Adrian had understood in a general background way, the way you understand things that are true but haven't yet required action. Dominic was his mother's man. He had been his grandfather's man before that. The loyalty was structural, inherited, embedded in the bones of the operation, long before Adrian had taken it over. It was the kind of loyalty that usually it didn't matter, because usually the interests of the family's leadership aligned. Today they did not align. Dominic had watched Adrian's face in that corridor. Then he had gone to a room on the 3rd floor, not a hotel room, a room he'd reserved specifically for this purpose, because Dominic Ferrante was not a man who moved without having prepared the terrain, and he had made a phone call. The phone call was to a man named Salvatore Greco. Salvatore Greco was not at the wedding. He was not a Vescari family member and not an associate. He was, specifically, the kind of man that Adrian's particular world produced and then tried very hard to keep compartmentalized: a competitor, a rival, someone who occupied the same shadow geography as the Vescari Empire but had been kept, through years of careful management and occasional direct confrontation, at a sufficient distance that the two operations didn't bleed into each other. Dominic had been talking to Salvatore Greco for 11 months. This was the thing that Adrian did not know, the thing that Marco did not know, the thing that was about to become the only thing that mattered. The ceremony proceeded. They said their vows in front of 312 people, some of whom were still processing what had just happened, and some of whom had decided to simply be present for the moment, which was, by any measure, a remarkable one. Adrian's voice, when he spoke his vows, was the same voice he'd used for his speech, controlled, precise, with the specific weight of someone who does not make promises casually and knows, as he makes them, exactly what they cost. Nia's voice was different, steadier than it had any right to be, given everything, with a quality of simple truth in it that several people in the room would remember for years afterward. Keisha cried. She had given up fighting it somewhere around the second exchange of rings and simply let it happen with quiet dignity. Dante in the second row had his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was also fighting tears and refusing to lose. He lost, briefly, when the rings were exchanged, and then reassembled himself and looked straight ahead. Marcella did not cry. She sat in the front row, with her hands still folded, and her back still straight, and her face in the composed, distant expression of a woman who is surviving something by sheer force of the habit of endurance. Whatever was happening inside her, and something was happening, Nia could see that, even through the haze of the ceremony, she was not going to display it here. Not in this room. Not in front of these people. That was, Nia thought, almost admirable. Almost. When it was done, when the officiant pronounced them, husband and wife and Adrian kissed her with a brevity that was somehow more intimate than extravagance would have been, just his hands on her face and his forehead briefly against hers. Before he pulled back, the room came alive, in the way rooms do when the held breath finally releases. The sound was enormous and warm and complicated, the way all sounds are that contain the emotions of 300 people simultaneously. They walked back up the aisle together, Nia's hand in Adrian's, the specific warmth of it, the grip still slightly tighter than it needed to be. They were almost at the back of the room when Marco appeared. He materialized at Adrian's elbow with the particular smoothness of someone who had been positioned deliberately to be exactly where he needed to be at exactly this moment. His face was professionally neutral in a way that Nia had learned, in 3 years of being adjacent to the people in Adrian's world, meant something had happened that required immediate, private attention. Adrian saw it. She felt his hand change, not release hers, but shift. The grip went from warm to calculated in a single second, the way a hand changes when the person it belongs to stops feeling and starts operating. 2 minutes, Marco said quietly to Adrian only. Adrian glanced at Nia. Reception, he said to her. Go to Keisha. I'll be there. Something in his face, something small, something that she would analyze for a long time afterward, made her hesitate. What's wrong, she said. Nothing yet, he said. 2 minutes. She let go of his hand. She went toward the reception room with Keisha at her side, and 300 people flowing around them like water, and she smiled at the people who reached for her and accepted the congratulations and kept the specific part of her attention that was tuned to Adrian's frequency, tracking him, even through walls, even through the noise and the motion and the generous, insulating chaos of 300 people who were largely by now thinking about champagne. In the corridor outside the ceremony room, Adrian looked at Marco. Tell me, said. Marco looked at him the way Marco only looked at him when the news was bad, in a specific way, not dangerous, exactly, but structurally significant, kind of bad that changed the map. Dominic made a call this morning, Marco said, before the ceremony. We pulled the log 20 minutes ago. He paused. He called Greco. The name landed in the corridor between them, like a stone dropped into still water. Adrian said nothing. The call was 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Marco said. We don't have content, but we have the timing. He paused again, And this time the pause carried the specific weight of more. Adrian. Dominic's been on Greco's secondary line 11 times in the last 4 months. We only found this because of the flag we put on Dominic's communications after the Hargrove contract irregularity in March. He kept his voice level, professional. We should have flagged it earlier. I should have flagged it earlier. I'm telling you that directly. Adrian's face did not change. That was the thing about him in moments like this. The absence of visible reaction was not the absence of a reaction. It was the reaction, the specific, deliberate, effortful control of a man who has trained himself to take information without letting the information take him. 4 months, he said, at minimum. What did Greco know that he could only know from inside this family? Marco's jaw moved, the Hargrove deal terms, the Meridian account restructure, the timeline on the Brooklyn asset transfer. He stopped. All of it things that Dominic had access to. The corridor was very quiet. Outside, through the closed doors, the sound of 300 people beginning to celebrate filtered through the wall's glass and voices, and the distant start of the reception music. "Where's Dominic now?" Adrian said. Last confirmed location was the 3rd floor business center, 40 minutes ago. He's not in the ceremony room. He wasn't in the ceremony room. Marco paused. I don't think he planned to stay. Adrian absorbed this. 11 calls. 4 months. Greco's secondary line, not his main number, not the line you'd call for social reasons, but the number that functioned specifically as the channel for operational communication. Dominic had not been passing gossip. He had been passing intelligence. Structured, specific, valuable intelligence about the inner workings of the Vescari operation, delivered to a competitor over a period of time that encompassed the Hargrove deal, the Meridian restructure, and the Brooklyn assets, 3 of the most significant moves Adrian had made in the last year. He stood very still in the corridor, and he thought about Dominic Ferrante. 22 years, the way the man sat in meetings, the way he drafted documents, the particular quality of his discretion, which Adrian had always read as loyalty, and was now reading, with the revision that comes when new information rewrites old memories, as something else entirely. The discretion of man who knows where the bodies are buried, because he helped bury them, and who has been quietly deciding, for some period of time, which way to run. Has Greco done anything with the information? Adrian said. Nothing yet that we can identify. Marco's voice was careful. But the timeline, the Brooklyn transfer closes in 11 days, Adrian. If Greco knows the full structure of that deal, he can front-run it, Adrian said, flat, factual. He can move assets into position before we close and dilute the entire acquisition. Yes, which would cost, he did the math in his head. He did it fast, somewhere between 8 and 12 million, depending on how aggressive he is. Conservatively, Marco said. The sound of the reception filtered through the walls again. Someone was laughing. A bright, uncomplicated sound. Adrian looked at the floor for a moment, just a moment, and then he looked up. Find Dominic, he said. And when we find him, bring him to me. He paused. Quietly. I don't want this in the room. He meant the reception. He meant his wife and 300 guests. And the day that was supposed to be something other than this. I want it contained. And Marco. His voice stopped him. I want to know when the call was made. Exactly when. Before or after the ceremony started. Marco looked at him. Understanding what the question actually was, whether Dominic had made the call, knowing what Adrian was about to do at the altar, or whether it had been a preemptive move made on information gathered earlier. We have it at 12:53, Marco said. The ceremony started at 2, an hour before. An hour before Adrian had stood at the altar and done what he'd done, which meant Dominic had made the call before he knew what Adrian was going to say, which meant something else, which meant that Dominic's move had not been a response to Adrian's public declaration, it had been the reason for it. Or at least, it had been the specific reason that the morning had gone the way it had. Because if Dominic had been passing information to Greco for 4 months, and today of all days, this particular day had been the day he chose to make direct contact, then today was not a coincidence. Today was a timing decision. Today was chosen. He called Greco when he saw my face in the corridor, Adrian said. Not a question. Working it out. Marco was quiet. He watched me come away from the bridal suite, Adrian said. He saw what I looked like. He knew what was about to happen today, and he told Greco what. that the leadership of this family is about to have a public fracture event, that the succession structure is going to shift, that this is the moment to move. He paused. He handed Greco a window. That's the analysis, Marco said. He's been waiting for instability, Adrian said. 4 months of feeding him information and waiting for a moment where everything was already in motion and the noise would cover the... He stopped. Because he had just understood something else. He had just understood that Dominic had not made 11 calls. He had made 11 logged calls on the secondary line, which meant Dominic knew or suspected that his primary communications were monitored, which meant the 11 calls were what he had been willing to risk being seen, which meant the actual volume of contact with Greg was almost certainly larger and had been running through channels that Marco's people had not yet found. He felt, for the first time that day, something that was not controlled, something that came up from somewhere below the operational calm and pushed against the back of his chest with the specific, ugly pressure of a man realizing that the ground he has been standing on is hollower than he knew. He had spent this morning thinking about his mother, about Nia, about the public declaration he was going to make, and what it would cost him in family politics and how he was going to manage the fallout. He had been entirely focused on the interior of this family, on the wound inside his own house. And while he was focused inside, someone had been moving outside. "Get me Dominic," he said. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the reception room door. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the handle, on the other side of which 300 people were drinking his champagne and celebrating his marriage, and expecting him to walk in and be a groom. And he did the thing that he had been doing his whole life. He filed it. He put it behind his jaw and behind his eyes, and somewhere in the cold operational part of his mind that never fully turned off, and he put his face back into something that could pass for the face of a man having the best day of his life. Then he opened the door. Nia saw him the moment he walked in. She was standing with Keisha and 2 of her aunts from Baltimore, a glass of champagne in her hand, and she had been smiling, genuinely smiling. The specific smile she got when her aunts were talking, because her Baltimore aunts were deeply funny women. And when she saw his face, the smile stayed in place, but her eyes changed. He watched her eyes change. She had known him for 3 years. She could read him in ways that people who had known him 20 years could not, because she read him the way people read the people they sleep next to, not from his expressions, but from the small involuntary things that happened below them. The set of his shoulders, the quality of his walk, the specific angle of his jaw that meant something was wrong and being managed. She excused herself from her aunts. She crossed the room to him. She didn't say anything. She just stood in front of him with her champagne glass and her pearl clips and her eyes that had stopped being celebratory and were now doing something considerably more focused. And she looked at him the way she always looked at him when she was deciding what was actually happening versus what was being presented to her. "What happened?" she said. Not loudly, not publicly, just to him. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the corridor that morning, about what she'd said to his mother, about the way she'd answered the hardest question she had ever been asked with a quietness that had more authority in it than anything Marcella had brought into that room. He thought about the fact that she was his wife now, that he had stood in front of 300 people and said exactly what that meant to him, that he had made a promise in the most public way he knew how to make one. He thought about the fact that Dominic Ferrante, a man who had sat at this family's table for 22 years and eaten their food and taken their money and built his career on their name, had spent 4 months selling that name to a rival and had chosen today, specifically today, to make it matter. He thought about the specific cruelty of that timing, calculation in it, the way it had been designed to land, at the precise moment when Adrian was most exposed, most publicly committed, most emotionally extended, most visibly vulnerable, so that whatever Greco was planning would hit a man who was already off balance. He looked at Nia. He said quietly, in the specific register he used when he was not going to say it twice, and needed her to understand every word, "I need you to stay in this room. Enjoy the reception. Keep the night normal. Whatever anyone says to you about anything tonight is normal." She looked at him for a long moment. "How bad is it?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. The reception moved around them, glass and music and voices and the beautiful ordinary noise of a celebration. And they stood in the middle of it like two people in the eye of something that no one else in the room could see. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the truest thing he'd said all day. She looked at his face for another second, reading him, finding what she needed to find. Then she nodded once. She lifted her champagne glass slightly, not a toast, just an acknowledgement, just a small gesture that said, "I hear you. I'm with you. Go do what you have to do." And she turned back toward her aunts. Adrian watched her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the corridor where Marco was waiting. And behind him, the reception continued its beautiful noise. And somewhere on the 3rd floor of this hotel, a man named Dominic Ferrante was making his 3rd attempt to reach Salvatore Greco on a phone that Marco's people had, 11 minutes ago, quietly ensured would not connect to anything at all. And in the lobby, where the afternoon light came through the tall windows in long, clean lines across the marble floor, 2 men in suits who did not work for the hotel were standing with their hands folded and their eyes on the elevator, waiting for a door to open. The day that was supposed to be the best of Nia's life had become something else entirely. And the man she had just married, the man she had chosen with clear eyes and full knowledge of what his world looked like, was about to find out how deep the damage went, and whether there was anything left of what he thought he'd built that hadn't already been quietly, methodically, handed to the enemy. Dominic Ferrante was in room 317 when they found him. He was sitting at the small desk near the window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. And when the door opened, not knocked, opened, because Marco had a keycard and Dominic had known, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, that a keycard was coming, he didn't flinch. He didn't stand. He just looked at the 2 men who walked in ahead of Adrian and then at Adrian himself, and his face did something complicated that settled, after a moment, into the expression of a man who's been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down. Not relief, exactly. Something more resigned than relief. Adrian closed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at Dominic, at the silver hair and the rolled sleeves and the untouched water and the 22 years of breakfasts and board meetings and the specific accumulated weight of a man who had been, for longer than Adrian wanted to calculate right now, something other than what he appeared. And he felt the thing he'd been filing away, since Marco had said Greco's name in the corridor, finally push through the filing system and arrive somewhere real. It was not hot. That was the thing about the worst kind of anger. It didn't burn. It settled. "You want to tell me," Adrian said. "Or you want me to tell you what I already know and we can go from there." Dominic looked at him. "How much do you know?" 11 calls. 4 months. Greco's secondary line. Adrian pulled the desk chair from the corner and sat down across from him, which was a deliberate choice. Sitting said, "This is a conversation, not an execution, at least not yet." The Hargrove terms, meridian. He paused. "And I know the call this morning was timed." Dominic's jaw moved. "Yes," he said, "just that." He did. "Yes." The 2 men Adrian had brought stood near the door and the window respectively, present without participating, which was exactly what they were there for. "Why?" Adrian said. One word. Not loud, not inflected as a question, because it wasn't a question. It was an invitation to say the thing that needed to be said before anything else could happen. Dominic looked at the untouched glass of water. Then he looked back up. "Your grandfather built this family's legal structure over 30 years, he said. "Every account, every entity, every layered holding company. I was there for the last 14 of those years. I know where every dollar came from and where every dollar went. Your grandfather trusted me with that because I never once gave him a reason not to." He paused. "Your father was the same. Different man. Same. Get to it, Dominic." "I'm getting to it." His voice was even. Not defensive flat in the way of a man who has rehearsed this. Maybe not consciously, but in the way you rehearse things you've been carrying long enough. When you took over, you moved fast. Faster than your father. Faster than anyone expected. You restructured things. You moved money in ways your grandfather would not have moved it, and you did it without. He stopped. Adjusted. You did it without fully understanding, I think, what some of those structures were protecting. Adrian looked at him. "What structures?" The Meridian account isn't just a holding vehicle, Dominic said. It hasn't been for 12 years. Your grandfather used it to route specific payments to 3 people who are currently sitting in very comfortable retirement because of what they know and what they agreed not to say. He held Adrian's gaze. When you restructured Meridian in February, you changed the payment architecture. 2 of those 3 payments haven't cleared since March. Silence. Those people, Adrian said, slowly, are going to start talking. One of them already has. Dominic's voice didn't waver. Not to law enforcement, not yet. But they've made contact with someone who has law enforcement connections. And that contact was made 8 weeks ago. He paused. Greco knows this. I told him, because I thought I needed leverage to manage the situation from outside the family structure. Because inside the family structure, there was no one I could tell without. Without it getting back to me, Adrian said. Without it getting back to you before I understood what you were going to do about it. The room was very quiet. Adrian sat with this. He sat with it the way he sat with things that required actual processing rather than operational response, with a particular quality of stillness that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening and was, from the inside, the most active state he ever occupied. His grandfather had bought silence. 3 people. Payments routing through Meridian for 12 years. And Adrian had restructured Meridian in February without knowing, because Dominic had never told him, because Dominic had been protecting what? The secret, himself, the family, some combination of all 3 that had calcified over 12 years into something that felt, to Dominic, like its own kind of loyalty. Who are the 3 people, Adrian said. Dominic told him. 2 of the names Adrian didn't recognize. The 3rd made his chest do something specific and unpleasant, a name that connected to a thing he had heard about, obliquely, once, years ago. In the particular way you hear about things in this world when people want you to know something existed without telling you what it was. How much exposure, Adrian said. If they talk? Significant. Dominic's voice was careful. Not to you personally. The insulation your grandfather built is still structurally intact. But to the family name. To the legitimate businesses. To the foundation. He paused. To Nia. Adrian looked at him sharply. The foundation gala, Dominic said. She's been listed as co-chair. Her name is publicly attached to Vescari to charitable operations. If this surfaces and the Vescari name takes damage, her name takes damage with it. Adrian stood up. He stood up from the chair, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the city for a moment, the same city Nia had been looking at from 4 floors above this morning, the same ordinary, relentless motion of it, and he pressed one hand flat against the glass and breathed. In, out. He had spent this morning protecting Nia from his mother. He had spent this afternoon discovering that there was a second threat he hadn't known existed, and both of them, in their completely different ways, had arrived on the same day. He turned back to Dominic. You went to Greco, he said, because you thought Greco could help you manage this quietly. I thought his connections on the municipal side. Greco doesn't have municipal connections, Adrian said. Greco has people who pretend to have municipal connections until they've gotten everything they need from you and then they burn you and walk away. He looked at Dominic directly. You've been in this world for 22 years. You know what Greco is. Dominic was quiet. You panicked, Adrian said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a diagnosis. You've been carrying this for months, and you panicked, and you called the wrong man, and you told him things that are now. He stopped. Did the calculation. What did you tell him about the Brooklyn transfer? Dominic's face changed, just slightly, but Adrian saw it. Dominic. His voice dropped. What did you tell him about Brooklyn? I told him the timeline, Dominic said. And the structure. I didn't give him the counterparty details. You gave him the timeline and the structure, Adrian repeated, slowly, like a man reading a sentence back to confirm he's understood it. The transfer closes in 11 days. He knows the timeline. He knows the structure. He doesn't need the counterparty details. He looked at the ceiling for 1 second, then back at Dominic. He can file an injunction. Dominic went pale. It won't hold, he said quickly. A frivolous injunction on a clean transfer, it doesn't need to hold. It needs to delay. Adrian's voice was completely controlled in the way that was worse than shouting. 11 days. If he files tomorrow morning, he buys himself 10 days of legal noise while we spend money and time and attention fighting a filing That means nothing. And while we're doing that, while every lawyer in my operation is focused on a frivolous injunction, what is he doing with the window? Dominic had no answer. He's acquiring, Adrian said. He's moving into the position that Brooklyn was supposed to give us, and he's doing it 10 days before we close, using information that you gave him. And by the time the injunction is dismissed and we can move, he's already there. He paused. 12 to 15 million. Minimum. The room had the specific quality of a space in which something irreversible has just been fully understood. Dominic put his face in his hands. It was the first genuinely uncontrolled thing he'd done since they walked in, and it lasted about 4 seconds before he pulled his hands away and looked up and put his face back together. But those 4 seconds were significant because they were the first moment in this conversation where Dominic Ferrante looked his actual age. "I can fix it," he said. "Tell me how." Greco wants the information because it gives him leverage. But what he actually wants, what he's always wanted, is the meridian structure. Not the payments, not the people. The structure. The legal architecture your grandfather built. The most sophisticated, private asset protection mechanism he's ever seen, and he wants it for his own operation. Dominic's voice had shifted, had found something that sounded like the man who had spent 22 years being very good at a specific thing. I can offer him a version of it. Enough to satisfy the want without giving him anything that actually touches the family's core assets. Clean version, legally built, that serves his purposes without. "You want to negotiate with Greco," Adrian said. "I want to give him something that makes him put the injunction down. And the 3 people." Dominic paused. "That's separate." "No, it isn't." Adrian's voice was flat. "Nothing in this is separate. Everything connects. That's the thing you apparently lost sight of, somewhere in the last 4 months." He moved away from the window and stood in the center of the room and looked at Dominic with the specific look that people who worked for him had learned to read as the look that preceded a decision that would not be revisited. "You built a side channel to manage a problem that was mine to manage, and in doing that, you handed an adversary a weapon pointed at my wife's name. On my wedding day." He let that sit. "Tell me why I shouldn't end your access to everything right now." Dominic looked at him. "Because I'm the only one who knows where everything is," he said. Not arrogantly, just factually. "Your grandfather built the structure around me. It's not documented in any way that anyone else can follow. If you remove me now, you spend 6 months with your lawyers trying to reconstruct things that Greco is going to be moving against in 11 days. He paused. "I know that's not a comfortable thing for me to say to you right now. I'm saying it anyway because it's true, and you need true more than you need comfortable." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Get up." Dominic got up. "You're going to call Greco," Adrian said. "Right now. From your phone. And you're going to tell him that the conversation you had this morning was preliminary. That you need 24 hours to confirm what you're offering him is structurally sound." He paused. "You're going to buy me 24 hours. And if he doesn't take 24 hours, he'll take it. He's been patient for 4 months. 1 more day doesn't cost him anything." Adrian's voice was precise. "And while you're buying me 24 hours, I'm going to make 3 calls that restructure the Brooklyn timeline in a way that takes away his window. We push the close date. We change the counterparty sequence. We make the position he thinks he's moving into not the position anymore." He looked at Dominic. "Can you make the call convincingly?" "Yes," Dominic said. "Then make it." Dominic picked up his phone. He dialed. Adrian stood at the window and listened to the one-sided conversation with the particular quality of attention of a man who is listening not just to what is being said, but to every micro-hesitation and vocal quality that might indicate whether the performance is landing. Dominic was good. Whatever else he was genuinely good at this, the controlled voice, the appropriate ambiguity, the careful performance of a man who was offering something valuable and needed to seem like he was doing it carefully rather than desperately. Call lasted 6 minutes. When Dominic hung up, he looked at Adrian. 24 hours. Adrian nodded once. Then he took Dominic's phone from his hand. "You'll get it back tomorrow," he said, "after Brooklyn is restructured and the 3 payments are reinstated through a new vehicle." He handed the phone to Marco. "He stays in this room tonight." Dominic didn't protest. "I'm not your enemy," Dominic said quietly as Adrian moved toward the door. Adrian stopped. "Look back." "No," he said. "You're something worse. You're someone I trusted." He left. The corridor outside room 317 was empty and clean and smelled like hotel carpet and recycled air, and Adrian stood in it for exactly 5 seconds, doing nothing. 5 seconds to let the thing behind his jaw be real. For just a moment, the specific, exhausting, ugly weight of discovering that betrayal doesn't always look like betrayal. Sometimes it looks like 22 years of loyalty, slowly turning, under pressure, into something else, without anyone noticing the turn, until the thing it's become is already in the room. Then he got on the phone. He called his primary attorney, not Dominic. Never Dominic again. For anything structural, a woman named Eleanor Park, who had worked for him directly for 6 years, and who had the specific quality of brilliance that expressed itself not in speed, but in the absolute refusal to be rattled. He told her what he needed. He told her the timeline. He used precise numbers and clean sentences, and she asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which were exactly the right questions, and told him she'd have the restructured Brooklyn sequence to him by 9 the next morning. He called the counterparty on the Brooklyn deal, a man named Reyes, who was in Los Angeles and was not pleased to be called at what was, on his coast, 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday, and told him the close date was moving 72 hours. Reyes pushed back. Adrian explained, without explaining, that it was necessary. Reyes pushed back again. Adrian said a specific number, a number that represented a meaningful adjustment to the fee structure in Reyes' favor, and Reyes stopped pushing back. He called a third person, whose name was not in any document connected to his legitimate businesses, and he said 4 words, "Greco is moving again." The person on the other end said nothing for a moment and then said, "Timeline?" And Adrian said, "He thinks 11 days. We've just made it 72 hours. The person said, "I'll make some calls." Adrian said, "Tonight." The person hung up. He stood in the corridor and looked at his watch. 4:47. He had been out of the reception for 1 hour and 12 minutes. He put his phone in his jacket pocket and straightened his jacket and walked back toward the elevator and pressed the button for the floor where 300 people were eating dinner and drinking and celebrating something that had started this. Mourning as a wedding and had become, over the course of the day, something considerably more complicated and considerably more real. When he walked back into the reception room, Nia saw him immediately. She was at the head table with Keisha and Dante and 2 of her Baltimore aunts, and she was laughing at something. One of the aunts had said genuinely laughing. The full laugh that she only produced when something was actually funny. And then she saw Adrian come through the door, and the laugh didn't stop immediately. It finished its natural arc, but her eyes changed in the middle of it. She watched him cross the room. He sat down beside her and reached for his water glass and drank from it and set it down. And she leaned slightly toward him, not visibly, not in a way that the table would notice, just by a degree, and said very quietly, under the noise of the table conversation, "How bad?" He looked at the table, at the plates and the glasses, and Dante telling one of her aunts something that was making the aunt laugh, at the reception that had continued, faithfully and normally, while he spent an hour in a hotel room, finding out how many different ways a single day could try to take things from him. Manageable, he said, which was true. But bad, she said. He looked at her. Yes. She picked up her champagne glass and held it without drinking and looked at the table for a moment. He watched her process. He had always loved that about her, the visible quality of her thinking, the way you could actually see her taking information and turning it into something she could work with. Over, she said. Not yet. He paused. Tomorrow. She nodded slowly. Okay. Nia, I'm not going to ask you to explain tonight, she said. I know tonight isn't the night for it. She looked at him directly. But I need you to hear me say that I'm not going to live in pieces of information. I need all of it, whatever this is. Her voice was quiet and completely level. When it's over, I need all of it. Yes, he said. You'll have it. She held his gaze for 1 more second, making sure the yes was the real kind, the kind that didn't have exceptions built into it. And then she looked back at the table and smiled at something. Her aunt said, and re-entered the conversation with a fluency that he found, in that moment, genuinely extraordinary. He sat beside her and watched the room and kept his phone in his pocket and waited. At 6:15, his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. Marco. He excused himself quietly and stepped into the corridor. Tell me, said. Greco filed, Marco said. Adrian stopped walking. He filed. 40 minutes ago, his attorney submitted an emergency injunction application to the commercial court. He didn't wait for tomorrow. Marco's voice was tight. He used a different structure than we expected. He's not challenging the Brooklyn transfer directly. He's challenging the holding company that owns the entity making the transfer. He's claiming the holding company has a beneficial ownership dispute that prevents it from. He found the Meridian connection, Adrian said. Silence. How? Marco said. We only just Dominic didn't give him just the structure, Adrian said. The thing behind his jaw was back, pressing harder now. He gave him the Meridian connection. He gave him enough to build a chain from the holding company to Meridian and file on the ownership question. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth. He gave him more than he admitted. What do you want me to do? Adrian looked at the corridor wall, at the clean, neutral hotel wallpaper, at nothing. Eleanor Park had the restructuring, but that was the Brooklyn timeline, not the holding company. The injunction attacked a different layer. A layer that couldn't be restructured in 24 hours because it was structural in a different way and went back to the original architecture, back to his grandfather's work, back to exactly the thing Dominic had described, undocumentable without him. He thought about the 3 people. He thought about the payments that hadn't cleared since March. He thought about Nia's name on the foundation gala invitation. He thought about Dominic sitting in room 317 with his hands folded and his face arranged in the expressions of a man who had just told him enough truth to seem honest, while apparently keeping the part that mattered most. Get Eleanor on the phone, Adrian said. Tonight, right now. Tell her the attack vector changed. I need her to understand the new structure of what Greco filed, and I need to know in the next 2 hours whether the holding company challenge can be defeated without exposing Meridian. He paused. If it can't be defeated that way, we need to know the cost of letting the injunction land and fighting it from the other side. The cost being Brooklyn doesn't close on any timeline, Adrian said. We lose the position entirely. Greco moves in. 15 million minimum, and the market position we've been building toward for 18 months. He stopped. Then, and I need Dominic out of that room. You want him. Bring him to me. Adrian's voice was completely cold now. Not the controlled cold of the corridor, but the specific temperature of a man who has finished being patient. He has 5 minutes to tell me the rest of what told Greco, or what happens next is not a conversation. He hung up. He stood in the corridor and looked at his watch. 6:19. Behind the reception room door, he could hear the band that had started playing 40 minutes ago, something slow and celebratory, something that belonged to a different version of this day, the version that had existed before noon, when the worst thing on the horizon was a mother who couldn't accept it as wife. He thought about Nia. He thought about what she'd said at the bridal suite this morning. My children will never beg anyone for permission to belong. He thought about what it meant that today, the day he had chosen to make the most public declaration of his life, to stand in front of everyone and say, here is who I am, and here is who she is, and here is what this family means. Now that today, specifically, had been the day Dominic chose to detonate. He thought about whether that timing was Dominic's choice or Greco's instruction. He thought about the fact that he didn't know yet, and that not knowing was its own kind of weapon. The elevator at the end of the corridor opened. Marco walked out. Behind him, Dominic Ferrante jacket back on, face composed, moving with the careful dignity of a man who knew exactly how bad his position was and had decided that the only remaining option was complete honesty, walked toward Adrian. He stopped 4 feet away. Adrian looked at him. The holding company, Adrian said. Tell me what you gave him. Dominic closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Opened them. Everything, he said. The word hit the corridor like something physical. The beneficial ownership structure. The Meridian routing. The 3 names. He held Adrian's gaze and his voice was completely steady in the way of a man who has passed through fear into the flat country on the other side of it. I gave him all of it because he told me that if I didn't, he was going to give what he already had to the Attorney General's office and burn the whole thing down anyway. He paused. I thought if he had everything, he'd use it commercially. I thought he'd want money. Not he doesn't want money, Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. He wants the position. He wants to be me. He looked at Dominic for a long moment. He's been building toward this for 4 months. And you built the road for him. Dominic said nothing. The three names, Adrian said. Can they be managed without Greco's involvement? One of them is already talking to someone, with federal connections, Dominic said. Payment gap made them nervous. They've been quiet for 12 years, and 3 missed payments in 4 months. They thought the arrangement was being discontinued. They got scared. So we reinstate the payments. It may not be enough anymore. Once someone's made contact outside the arrangement. Can it be managed? Adrian said again. Harder. Dominic looked at him. Yes, he said, but not from inside the family. You'd need someone Greco doesn't have access to. Someone whose connection to the Vescari operation is clean enough that it doesn't pull the thread. He paused. And you'd need to move on it tonight, not tomorrow. The corridor was the specific silence of a man calculating things that have no clean answer. Adrian pulled out his phone. He dialed a number that he had not dialed in over a year, a number that belonged to a relationship he had let go quiet because there had been no need for it, and that he was now bringing back because need had arrived in the most absolute possible form. The phone rang 3 times. The voice that answered was a woman's voice. Older. The specific quality of a woman who picked up calls at 6:30 on a Saturday evening without any detectable surprise, because in her world, calls at 6:30 on Saturday evenings were simply part of the geography. Adrian, she said. I need a favor, he said. Tonight. Pause. How large? Large, he kept his voice even. I'll explain the full picture in person. I need you in the city by 9. Another pause. Longer. I'll be there by 8:30, she said. She hung up. Adrian lowered the phone. He looked at Dominic. He looked at Marco. He looked at the corridor wall with its clean, neutral wallpaper and its nothing. And he thought about the fact that tonight, his wedding night, the night that was supposed to belong and sit inside the woman, sitting inside that room, laughing with her Baltimore aunts tonight, was going to be spent doing the thing he had spent his whole life learning how to do in the dark. Cleaning up messes that other people had made. Except this time, one of the messes had been made by someone he trusted, and the other mess had been waiting for him in his own foundation, built by his grandfather's hand, and he'd been standing on top of it for 18 months, without knowing, which was its own specific kind of failure that he was going to have to sit with at some point when there was some time to sit with things. He turned to Marco. I need you to go back in there, he said, meaning the reception. Sit at the table. Keep it normal. If Nia asks where I am, tell her I'm handling something, and I'll be back before the last dance. He paused. Make sure she has everything she needs. Marco nodded. And Dante, Adrian said. Send him out here. Marco went back through the door. Adrian stood in the corridor and waited, and the band inside played something slow, and the night outside the hotel was doing what the night always did, just arriving, just darkening. Completely indifferent to the specific human crisis contained within this building. And Dominic stood 3 feet away, with his hands at his sides, and his face in the expression of a man waiting to find out what the rest of his life looked like. The door opened. Dante came out. He looked at Adrian, and then at Dominic, and then back at Adrian, and his face went through the fast recalibration of someone piecing together a situation from insufficient information and landing somewhere in the vicinity of the correct conclusion. What do you need? Dante said. I need you to go to the Westchester house tonight, Adrian said. Before midnight, there's a safe in the floor of the study, you know the one. Yes, there are 3 envelopes in it. Yellow. Legal size. Your grandfather's handwriting on the front. He looked at his brother. Bring them to me. Don't open them. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Dante looked at him for a moment. This is bad, Dante said. Not a question, yes, Adrian said. It is. Does Nia know? She knows enough. He met his brother's eyes. Go. I need those envelopes before 9. Dante nodded. He started toward the elevator and then stopped and turned back. Adrian. His voice was different now. Not the younger brother tone, not the warmth. Something more direct. Whatever this is. You're going to get through it. Adrian looked at him, he said. Dante went. Adrian turned back to Dominic. You're going to write down everything, he said. Every call, every date, every piece of information you gave Greco. Chronological. Complete. He handed him the hotel notepad from the table in the alcove nearby. You're going to have it finished in 45 minutes. Dominic took the notepad, and Adrian's voice was very quiet, completely still. If there is one more thing you haven't told me, one more piece of this, that I find out from someone other than you tonight, there is nothing I will be able to do for you after that point. He held the man's gaze. Do you understand me? Dominic looked at him with the eyes of someone who understood perfectly. Yes, he said. Adrian walked back to the reception room door. He paused with his hand on the handle. Inside, the band was playing something new, something with a beat that had gotten people on their feet. From the sound of it, he could hear the floor vibrating slightly. He could hear the specific quality of 300 people who had decided, collectively, that tonight was worth celebrating. And were doing it with the uncomplicated wholeness of people who didn't know what was happening in the corridor outside. He opened the door. The warmth of the room hit him first, the accumulated warmth of people and candlelight, and the specific atmosphere that good food and good music and the general permission of a wedding created. He scanned the room automatically, the way he always scanned rooms, and found Nia immediately. She was on the dance floor. She was dancing with one of her Baltimore aunts, the taller one, the one who laughed the loudest, and she was laughing again. That full laugh, her head tipping back slightly, her dress moving around her, her grandmother's pearl clip still perfectly in place, and she was so completely and uncomplicatedly present in that moment that it stopped him where he stood in the doorway for just a second. Just a second. She looked up somehow through the crowd and the movement and the noise and found him. The laugh didn't stop, but her eyes changed. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, like she was reading him from a frequency most people couldn't receive. And he looked back at her across the dance floor with 300 people between them and the full weight of what the night still had to do, pressing against the back of his chest. And he gave her the smallest possible nod. I'm here. I'm handling it. Stay in this room. She held his gaze for one more beat. Then she turned back to her aunt. And Adrian moved through the room toward the corner table where his phone needed to be in his hand. And the next 3 hours needed to be planned with the precision of a man who was fighting on two fronts simultaneously, one in a courthouse that would open in the morning, and one in a room on the 3rd floor where an old man with silver hair was writing down everything he'd done and hoping it was enough to matter. The night had a long way to go. And somewhere across the city, Salvatore Greco was sitting in his own version of this room, with his own version of these calculations. And he was about to discover that the man he had been patiently dismantling for 4 months had just discovered the architecture of what he'd built, and was coming for it with everything he had left. The woman Adrian had called arrived at 8:23. Her name was Catherine Marsh, and she was 64 years old, and she had the specific quality of someone who had spent decades being underestimated and had long since stopped finding it interesting. She was not tall. She wore no jewelry except a watch. She carried a single leather briefcase that looked older than most of the people in Adrian's operation and contained, he knew from experience, everything she needed and nothing she didn't. She had been a federal prosecutor for 16 years before she left to do something considerably less scrutinized. And she had worked in the specific gray geography between legitimate and illegitimate power long enough that the distinction had stopped meaning much to her in the way it stopped meaning much to anyone who spent sufficient time at that border. She walked into the hotel business center on the 3rd floor, the same room where Adrian had sat with a glass of water. He didn't drink that morning, which felt like it belonged to a different week. And she looked at the table where Adrian sat with Dominic's written account in front of him, and Eleanor Park on speakerphone, and Marco standing near the window, and she assessed all of it in approximately 4 seconds. Show me the filing, she said. Marco handed her the printed copy of Greco's injunction application. She read it standing up. She read it the way lawyers who are very good at their work read things not linearly, but in a specific scanning pattern that pulled the structural elements before the detail, the architecture before the argument. Turned 2 pages, went back to the 1st page, turned to the 3rd. She set it down. This is a good filing, she said, not admiringly, just accurately. Whoever drafted this understood exactly where the vulnerability was. Can we defeat it? Adrian said. By what timeline? The court opens at 9 tomorrow morning. She looked at her watch. 8.5 hours. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and opened her briefcase. Tell me about the meridian structure. All of it. From the original architecture. Adrian told her. He told her everything: his grandfather's construction of it, the 3 names, and the payment arrangement, the gap created by his February restructuring, Dominic's contact with Greco, the specific pieces of information that had been passed. He told it flat and factual, and without the editorial that would have slowed it down. And Catherine listened. The way she always listened, with a stillness that suggested she was recording everything and would not need to hear any of it twice. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The 3 people, she said. The one who made outside contact. How far has that gone? Unknown, Adrian said. Dominic's assessment is that the contact was exploratory. No formal approach to law enforcement. Dominic's assessment, she said with a specific dryness, is worth approximately what tonight has shown us it's worth. She looked at him directly. I need to know the actual status. I need it too, he said. Then that's the first thing. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad, not the hotel's, her own, thick and specific and uncapped a pen. I can draft the counterfiling to Greco's injunction in the next 4 hours. The beneficial ownership challenge is technically well constructed, but there are 3 procedural vulnerabilities in how he filed it, and I can exploit all 3. It won't dismiss cleanly on first pass, but it will delay the effect long enough for you to restructure the holding company underneath it. She paused. That's the legal side. And the other side, Adrian said. She looked at him over the legal pad. The other side isn't mine. I know. He held her gaze. But you know the person I need for it. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that Marco looked at the floor, and Dominic, sitting in the corner with the hotel notepad on his knee, looked at the wall. Harold, she said finally. Yes, Adrian. Harold hasn't done active work in. I know what he hasn't done. His voice was patient. I also know what he can still do with a phone and the right name. The person who made the outside contact doesn't need to be pressured. They need to be reassured. They need to hear from someone they can believe that the arrangement is intact and the gap was administrative. He paused. Harold knows how to do that better than anyone I have access to. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. He's going to say no, she said. Call him anyway. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she reached for her own phone. She stepped away from the table to make the call. And Adrian looked at Dominic across the room, and Dominic looked back, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left that needed saying in this room. They had reached the specific place that you reach in a crisis where all the information is out and all the decisions have been made, and what remains is simply the waiting, the specific, exhausting, grinding weight of a man who has set things in motion and cannot know, yet whether they'll land. Adrian sat with it. He was good at sitting with it. He had been doing it his whole life. At 9:47, Eleanor Park sent the first draft of the restructured Brooklyn holding sequence to his phone. He read it, sent back 2 corrections. She had it back in 14 minutes, with the corrections incorporated and two additional protective clauses he hadn't thought of, which was why he paid her what he paid her. At 10:15, Catherine got off the phone with Harold. She came back to the table and sat down without saying anything for a moment. Then he'll make the call. Tomorrow morning. Before the court opens. She paused. He wants to speak to you directly after. I'll be available, Adrian said. He's doing this because of what you did for his granddaughter. 2 years ago, Catherine said. Not for money. I want you to understand what he's spending. I understand, Adrian said. She nodded once and picked up her pen. She wrote for 3 hours. Adrian stayed in the room for the first hour, making calls and reviewing documents, and doing the specific work of a man, dismantling a trap that someone else had constructed around him, and rebuilding the ground he was standing on in real time. Then he looked at his watches and saw that it was 11:04, and he stood up and straightened his jacket. I'll be back at 6, he told Marco. If anything changes before then, I'll call, Marco said. He looked at Dominic one final time. Dominic looked back. In the specific way of a man who knows exactly what he is now, not an enemy, not a colleague, but something in the difficult middle space of a person who has caused real damage and is now participating in the repair of it, which was neither redemption nor punishment, but simply the work that was left. Get some sleep, Adrian said to him. Tomorrow is going to be long. Dominic nodded. Adrian left the room and went to find his wife. The reception had ended at 10. The guests were gone, and the venue was in the early stages of the specific, controlled chaos of a space being returned to its neutral state caterers, moving tables, staff collecting centerpieces, the band's equipment being broken down in the corner. The room that had held 300 people and their accumulated emotion was becoming, again, just a room. Nia was sitting at the head table. Not waiting, she wasn't doing it in the posture of waiting. She was sitting with her heels off and her feet tucked under her and a glass of water in one hand and her phone in the other. And she was reading something on the phone with the focused attention she applied to things she was actually interested in, not the distracted scrolling of someone killing time. One of her pearl clips had come slightly loose and was sitting at a small angle that she hadn't bothered to fix. She looked up when he came in. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him all day, reading from the specific frequency that was his and only his, and she set her phone down. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. He sat in the chair beside, put at hers, and he looked at the elbows on the table and he looked at the empty room, at the candlelight, still burning in the centerpieces because no one had gotten to them yet, at the specific quiet of a celebration that has finished. And he felt, for the first time since said Greco's name in the corridor, the particular relief of a man who has come back to the one place in the world where he is not operating. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He told her all of it this time, not the edited version of the reception floor, not the "we'll talk later" of the corridor. He told her about Dominic and Greco, and the 4 months, and the 11 calls, and the Brooklyn deal, and the injunction, and the 3 people his grandfather had paid to stay quiet for 12 years, and the payments that hadn't cleared, and the outside. Contact, and Catherine and Harold, and what tonight had been, underneath the wedding, underneath the vows, and the champagne, and the first dance. She listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about her that had undone him. Early in their relationship, before he'd fully understood what he was dealing with, she listened, the way very few people listened, completely, without the small preparatory movements of a person composing their response while someone else is still talking. She just took it in, all of it, and when he finished, she sat with it for a moment that lasted long enough to be real, rather than performative. Then she said, "Your grandfather built an arrangement to protect the family using people's silence as the material." "Yes." "And you inherited it without knowing it existed." "Yes." And Dominic knew. For 14 years she looked at the candle nearest her, at the flame, which was doing what flames do, just burning, small and steady, completely indifferent, and he protected it by not telling you. He thought he was protecting it, Adrian said. I think until about 4 months ago, he genuinely believed that not telling me was the right way to manage it, that it was the kind of thing that managed itself as long as you paid the right people and didn't look at it directly. And then the payments stopped, and the structure that had been invisible became visible. She was quiet for a moment. "What happens tomorrow?" she said. He told her that too. The counterfiling, Harold's call, the Brooklyn restructure, the timeline. She listened. "And after tomorrow," she said. "After tomorrow, we find out what held and what didn't." He looked at her directly. "Some of it is going to cost. The Brooklyn delay is going to have consequences in the market position. Some of what Catherine files tomorrow might not land the way we need it to. There are variables I can't control. But you think it holds." "I think it holds," he said. Not with confidence exactly, with the specific quality of a man who has done every available thing and is now reporting his best assessment rather than a guarantee. "I think Greco overplayed. He got good information, and he moved too fast. He filed the injunction before he had the people side of it locked down, which means he's got a legal position but not the supporting architecture to hold it if we challenge hard." He paused. "Catherine's going to challenge hard." Nia looked at him for a moment. Then she reached over and straightened his tie. He hadn't realized it was crooked. The deliberate crookedness of the ceremony morning had long since become the natural crookedness of a 12-hour day, but she reached over and straightened it with 2 precise fingers and then sat back. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The 3 people, the ones your grandfather paid." She kept her voice completely level. "What they're being paid to be quiet about. Is it something I need the specifics of to understand what I married into? Or is it something that's been managed and is going to stay managed?" He looked at her. "It's going to stay managed," he said. "That's not an answer to what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. It's something from a long time before you or I were in each other's lives, he said. Something my grandfather did that was not right, that he compensated for in the only way he knew how. He paused. It doesn't touch you. It doesn't touch anything going forward. And yes, you deserve to know the specifics. And I'll tell you when it's not 11:15 on our wedding night. And I've been awake for 19 hours. He met her eyes. That's not avoidance, that's timing. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. He exhaled. Nia. He stopped. He looked at the candle for a moment and then back at her. I'm sorry. For today. For the version of this day that you deserved and didn't get. She looked at him for a long moment. I got married today, she said. To you. That part happened. She paused. Everything else is just everything else. He didn't say anything. I'm not going to pretend today was simple, she said. Your mother said what she said, and I'm going to be dealing with what that brought up in me for a while. And tonight was what it was, and you're going to be dealing with the fallout of it for longer than either of us wants. She looked at the table. But you stood at that altar, and you said what you said, and you meant it. I heard it. I'm keeping it. She looked up. That's what today was for me. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They sat in the guttering candlelight of the emptying reception room and didn't say anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation, the specific conversation of two people who have been through something difficult together and are now on the other side of it, not unmarked, but together. After a while, one of the venue staff came through to extinguish the candles and found them sitting there and apologized, and they both said it was fine, and they got up and left. The next 3 weeks were not easy. The counterfiling landed at 9:07. The following morning, 14 minutes after the court opened, Catherine had found all 3 procedural vulnerabilities and used them with the specific efficiency of someone who is very good at something and has adequate fuel and adequate motivation. The injunction was stayed within 6 hours, not dismissed. Stayed, which meant it existed, but couldn't be enforced while the procedural challenges were being adjudicated. Harold made his call at 8:45 that morning, before the court opened, and the person on the other side of it, the one who had made outside contact, who had spent 4 months, increasingly convinced that the arrangement was being quietly ended and that the people who had made it were preparing to leave them, exposed. That person listened to Harold's voice, which was the voice of someone they had trusted for 12 years, and they agreed to wait. Not forever, but long enough. The Brooklyn deal restructured on the revised timeline. They closed 17 days late rather than 11 days early, which cost Adrian a renegotiation premium that Eleanor Park handled with the quiet precision of someone spending someone else's money very carefully. The market position they'd been building toward was diluted, not destroyed, diluted by the delay, and Greco did move, but he moved into a narrower window than he'd had if the original timeline had held, and what he got was a fraction of what he'd calculated on. He did not file the information with law enforcement. This was the calculation Adrian had made in the corridor of the 3rd floor, between calling Catherine and calling Harold, that Greco wanted the position, not the destruction, that he was a commercial predator, not a personal one, that he had used the information as leverage to create the window, and once the window was gone, the information was simply information, and using it would cost him relationships and access that he needed more than he needed the satisfaction of the burn. The calculation was correct. Greco withdrew the injunction application 12 days after the wedding in a legal filing that said nothing interesting and communicated, between its lines, everything necessary. The matter had been resolved to the parties' satisfaction, which was lawyer speak, for we both have too much to lose to escalate this further. Dominic Ferrante resigned formally from his position as the Vescari family's legal counsel on the 4th day after the wedding. He submitted the resignation in writing to Adrian directly in a letter that was 6 sentences long and contained no justification and no self-defense. Just the facts. The date, the position, the resignation, and, at the very end, a single sentence that Adrian read twice. I should have told you about Meridian when you took over. That is the thing I will not be able to undo. Adrian filed the letter. He didn't respond to it. He spent 2 weeks with Eleanor Park rebuilding the Meridian architecture from the ground up, not the same structure, not his grandfather's structure, but a new one that served the necessary function without the specific hidden chambers that had made it vulnerable to someone with inside knowledge. The 3 payment arrangements were restructured into a new vehicle, clean and documented and legal in the specific way that made them both sustainable and defensible. This is resumed. The person who had made outside contact received a direct communication from Harold confirming continuity, and the contact was withdrawn. It was not a perfect resolution. It left marks, it cost money and time, and the specific emotional currency that you spend when you spend weeks repairing something that someone you trusted broke. And that currency does not have a clean exchange rate. Adrian knew this. He processed it in the specific way. He processed difficult things at night, mostly in the quiet after Nia was asleep, when the operational demands of the day were done, and there was nothing left to manage except the interior accounting. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about the specific bargain. The old man had made the decision to buy silence rather than face consequences, to build the arrangement into the family's financial architecture, and trust that the structure would outlast the problem. He thought about the way that decision had been passed down, not through explicit instruction, but through the simple architecture of the thing itself, invisible until it became visible, which was the nature of all inherited problems. He thought about what he was going to pass down. This was the thing that stayed with him longest. Not Dominic, not Greco, not the 12 million in diluted market position. The question of what he was building, that his children would inherit without knowing it. He didn't have an answer. He was working on it. Marcella called 3 times in the 2 weeks after the wedding. Adrian answered the second call. They spoke for 11 minutes, which was a conversation he did not describe to anyone in detail afterward. What Nia gathered from his face when he came back into the kitchen after it was that it had been hard, and that it had been necessary, and that it had ended at a place that was not resolution, but was something innocent, which was perhaps more durable than resolution. He told Marcella, the same thing he'd told her implicitly at the altar, that she could be part of what came next, but only as the person she needed to become, not the person she had been. That this was not punishment. It was simply the shape of what was available. Marcella did not respond immediately. She was not a woman who responded immediately to things that cost her something. 3 months passed. They were 3 months of ordinary difficulty, the specific ordinary difficulty of building a marriage between 2 people who are not simple, who come from different worlds, who are both too stubborn and too smart for their own peace, who love each other in the complicated way that people who see each other clearly love each other. They argued about small things and some medium things and navigated the larger things with the imperfect, effortful grace of 2 people who have decided that the other person is worth the work. Nia went back to her classroom the week after the wedding. She walked in on a Monday morning, and her 3rd graders looked at her with the specific delight that children produce when a person they love comes back after an absence, and she sat down on the reading rug with them and read them a story about a girl who builds a house from the materials other people left behind, and she felt, doing it, the specific settled rightness of a woman who knows what she is and where she belongs. She told Adrian about the story that evening. He listened the way he always listened. She built it better than the original, Nia said about the story's ending. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Now she started to show around month 4. Not dramatically. She was not the kind of woman whose pregnancy announced itself loudly. She was the kind of woman whose body made room for the new thing quietly, integrating it, and she went about her life with the same groundedness she brought to everything, slightly more tired than usual, slightly more careful, carrying the specific interior knowledge of a person who knows that the world is about to change shape again. Adrian knew before she told him. He knew the morning she made tea instead of coffee without explaining why, which she had never done in 3 years. He knew the way you know things about someone you have been paying deep attention to, not by evidence alone, but by the accumulation of small signals that add up, in the body of someone who is watching to a certainty. He didn't say anything. He waited for her to tell him. She told him on a Tuesday evening in November, in the kitchen of their apartment, not the penthouse where they'd originally planned to live, but the brownstone in Brooklyn that she'd suggested, and he'd agreed to, the one with the actual neighbors and the building supernamed Gerald, who fixed things with varying success in the coffee shop on Famaman on the corner where the staff knew her order. She told him matter-of-factly, because that was how she told things. She was making soup, and he had just come in from whatever the day had been, and she turned from the stove and said, "I have something to tell you," and told him. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his coat. He stood there for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and he put his hands on her face gently, which was not always the register his hands operated in, but gently, and he looked at her for a moment in a way that she would not be able to describe afterward, except to say that it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, the least managed, the least performed, the face of a man to whom something so enormous had just happened that the machinery of control hadn't arrived yet to cover it. "Are you okay?" he said. "Yes," she said, "are you?" He stopped. His thumbs were at her temples very lightly. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "are you?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it wasn't with a word. He pulled her toward him and held her in the kitchen with the soup bubbling on the stove and the November dark at the windows, and she could feel his breathing, the specific quality of it, the way it was slightly uneven, in a way that was completely unlike him, and she let him hold her for as long as he needed to. It was a while. It was a while. The night that mattered, the one that the story had been building toward without either of them knowing it, came 6 months later on a Saturday in May. Adrian came home to find the kitchen occupied. Not just Nia. He heard voices before he reached the kitchen door, Nia's voice, and another voice, older, and he stopped in the hallway outside the kitchen door with his hand not quite on the handle and listened. Marcella's voice. He stood in the hallway and listened to the two women in his kitchen, his mother and his wife, and what he heard was not the conversation in the bridal suite. It was not the language of power or rejection or the careful violence of a woman defending a bloodline against a perceived threat. What he heard was his mother saying quietly that she had been wrong. She said it in the specific way that women who have never said it before say it, with the rough, unpolished quality of language that has not been practiced, that is being produced in real time without rehearsal. It did not sound graceful. It sounded effortful, which was the only way he would have believed it. He heard Nia say nothing for a moment. Then he heard her say, "I know. Not thank you. Not I forgive you. Just I know." He heard Marcella ask, after a brief silence, if she could. She said it with a hesitation that was almost painful to hear from a woman who had never hesitated about anything if she could put her hand on Nia's belly. He heard Nia say yes. He stood in the hallway and pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and felt something move through his chest that he did not have language for in the moment and would spend considerable time afterward trying to name. It was not happiness exactly, though it contained happiness. It was not relief, though there was relief in it. It was something older than either of those, something that had to do with the specific irreducible value of a thing that was almost broken and wasn't. He didn't go in. He stood in the hallway and let the moment belong to them. When he did go in 2 minutes later, 3, long enough that the moment had settled into something that could accommodate a third person, he found his mother sitting at his kitchen table with one hand resting gently against Nia's rounded belly, and his wife looking down at that hand with an expression that he had learned over the years to read as the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to trust something. Marcella looked up when he came in. Something moved across her face. He looked at her, at his mother, at the woman who had raised him in a world of sharp edges and high expectations, who had loved him in the specific way that people love things they also need to control, who had said something unforgivable to the woman he loved on the morning of his wedding, and was sitting in the kitchen 6 months, with her hand in that same woman's kitchen 6 months later, with her hand on the evidence of what the future was going to look like. And he looked at her for a long moment. "Ma," he said. She looked at him. It was the same look she'd worn at the altar, the look of a woman surviving something by the force of the habit of endurance, but softer now, around the edges. Not soft, just softer. Like something very hard had been worn slightly smooth by the months in between. "Sididi," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. He sat at his own kitchen table with his wife and his mother, and the child that was 6 months away from making him a father, and the kitchen smelled like the soup that Nia had been making when she told him 4 months ago, and the May light came through the windows the way May light does in Brooklyn, when the weather finally decides to cooperate, and nobody said anything significant for a while. Look, They talked about ordinary things. Gerald the super had finally fixed the kitchen faucet. Dante had a new job he was excited about. One of Nia's students had written a story about a dragon who was afraid of fire, which she found genuinely funny, which made Marcella ask about it, which led to Nia explaining the context, which led to a conversation about what children were like now versus what they'd been like 30 years ago. And Marcella had opinions about this, strong ones, which was not surprising, and Nia pushed back on two of them, which Marcella received with the specific surprise of someone who is still learning. That pushback is not the same as attack. It was not a perfect evening. It was too careful in places, too much silence where there might have been easier words, too much of the specific awkwardness of people who are trying to build something new on the same ground where they broke something old. Those things don't disappear because someone decides they're going to be different. They diminish over time if the work is done. They leave marks. The marks become part of the material. Marcella left at 9. Adrian walked her to the door. In the doorway, she paused. She was putting her coat on, and she had one arm through the sleeve, and she stopped and looked at him. "She's stronger than I gave her credit for," she said. Meaning Nia. "Yes," Adrian said, "she is." Marcella looked at him. "You chose well," she said. The same thing she'd said in the bridal suite doorway, but different now. Not the effortful concession it had been then. Something more settled. Something that had been tested against the months in between and had held. "I know," he said. She nodded once. Then she went. He stood in the doorway for a moment after her car pulled away. In the May night air, in the specific quiet of a Brooklyn street that was doing what Brooklyn streets do at 9 on a Saturday alive. Ordinary, unconcerned. He looked at the coffee shop on the corner. The light in the window of the apartment next door. Gerald sitting on the front stoop of the neighboring building with his hands on his knees, the way Gerald always sat. He went back inside. Nia was on the sofa with her feet up and her head tipped back and her eyes closed, which was the posture of a woman who has been social for several hours and is now done being social, which he respected deeply. He sat down beside her. She didn't open her eyes. "How are you?" he said. "Tired," she said, "and okay." A pause. "Those aren't opposites." "No," he said.
Yeah.
"They're not." She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She put her hand on my belly, she said. "I know. I heard." She turned her head to look at him. "You were in the hallway." For a couple minutes, she held his gaze. "You didn't come in." "No." She looked at him for a long moment, reading him, doing the specific reading that she had been doing for 3 years, and that he had come to understand was not scrutiny, but the particular intimacy of someone who cares what is actually happening inside you. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "It was yours, I know." She turned back to the ceiling. "That's why I'm thanking you." They sat in the quiet of the apartment. After a while, he put his hand over hers, where it rested on her belly, and felt, under his palm, the faint specific movement of something that was not yet here but was coming, that had been coming since a Tuesday evening in November, when a woman making soups turned from a stove and changed the shape of the world, that was going to arrive on its own schedule and in its own way and join a family that had been forged in the previous 6 months, not from ease but from the specific, costly, necessary work of people who had decided that what they were building was worth the damage the building caused. He felt the movement under his hand. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying more completely than he could. The child that came into the world 4 months later came into a family that had marks on it. Not a perfect family, not a clean one, not one that had arrived at this point without breaking things along the way. It came into a house where the people who loved each other did not always know how to show it, and sometimes showed it badly and tried again. It came into a family where one grandmother had once looked at its mother and decided she was not enough, and had spent a year discovering what it actually cost to hold that position, and was still, quietly, imperfectly, learning how to hold something else instead. It came into the world with a name they had chosen together, in the kitchen, on a winter evening when they couldn't agree on anything, and had eventually stopped arguing and started laughing, and arrived at the name the way you arrive at things when you stop trying too hard, suddenly, naturally, like it had been there the whole time waiting for them to find it. What it came into above everything else was a table. Table where the people at it had earned their seats not through bloodline, not through the inherited authority of a name, but through the specific daily work of showing up for each other, when showing up was hard. A table where belonging was not conditional on someone else's approval, because the people who had built it had decided, in the most public and permanent way available to them, that the only thing that determined who sat here was love and the willingness to earn it. The feared Mafia boss, it turned out, had understood something that his mother had not. That the most powerful thing you could give your family was not a name. It was a table that no one else could take from them. And around that table, in the brownstone in Brooklyn, where the super fixed things with varying success and the coffee shop on the corner knew everybody's order, the Vescari family began slowly, imperfectly, with all the marks of everything it had cost to get there to become something new.